dangerous, too challenging to the established order. Others were forgotten in caves, burned in libraries, or deliberately erased from memory. And then there are the voices that whisper from fragments, the writings that survived against the odds, carrying with them the weight of something forbidden. We live in a time obsessed with uncovering what has been hidden. Long-lost artifacts, ancient scrolls, forgotten knowledge buried beneath layers of dust and denial. But none of these discoveries carries the same power as when it touches faith itself, when it dares to ask whether the Bible we hold today is truly complete. This is where the Gospel of Peter emerges, not as a faint rumor, but as a provocative text that confronts the question, what were the early Christians hiding, and why was Peter's voice locked away for centuries? The story of the Gospel of Peter is as dramatic as the passion narrative it tells. It begins not with harmony, but with controversy. Early church leaders debated it fiercely, some revering it, others condemning it. And when the smoke of history cleared, it disappeared from sight, only to be rediscovered much later like a message in a bottle drifting back to shore. But unlike the familiar Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this text bore a different tone, one that unsettled, one that dared to depict the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus with imagery unlike anything preserved in the canon. Why would the church fathers suppress it? Why would Peter's supposed gospel be branded dangerous? Was it because it revealed too much, or perhaps revealed something that challenged the narrative the rising church wanted to maintain? Think of the world we live in today. Voices are censored, stories are manipulated, and truth is often drowned beneath the noise of power. That is not new. It has always been the way of things. And yet, history has a way of unearthing what was meant to be forgotten. The Gospel of Peter stands as a symbol of that unearthed truth, of forbidden knowledge pressing its way through silence. To read it is to enter a narrative that feels familiar and unfamiliar all at once. The crucifixion is described with haunting detail, but the resurrection scene, the resurrection, is unlike anything in the New Testament. Soldiers see a stone roll back by itself, a cross that speaks, a Christ who emerges taller than the heavens. It is imagery both mystical and majestic, almost cinematic, as though the veil of ordinary storytelling was torn away to show something that cannot be contained in human words. And this is where the mystery deepens. Was Peter truly its author? Or was his name attached to lend authority to a text written by another hand? Scholars debate endlessly, but for believers, the question is larger. Why was this text hidden, and what does it mean for our understanding of Jesus? Lost voices always carry weight, because they remind us of the fragility of memory. Think of the libraries burned in Alexandria, the scrolls scattered in the desert, the suppressed songs of enslaved peoples, the forgotten languages of tribes, erased by conquest. The Gospel of Peter belongs to that same family of silenced truths. Whether or not it is authentic in the scholarly sense, it is authentic in the sense that it was read, loved, feared, and ultimately buried. And now, we hold it again. Imagine Peter himself standing in front of you, scarred by denial, redeemed by love, strengthened by his encounter with the risen Christ. What would he tell you? What truths would he whisper that the world was not ready to hear? Would he affirm the canon we know, or would he unveil a dimension of Jesus' story we have overlooked? These are not just questions for historians. They are questions for anyone who seeks truth in a world where truth is fragile, contested, and often hidden behind curtains of power. The Gospel of Peter asks us to lean in closer, to not be satisfied with easy answers, and to wrestle with the possibility that God's story is bigger than the boundaries we have drawn. And so, as we step into this exploration together, I invite you not just to listen passively, but to engage with the journey. If you want to uncover more about these hidden Gospels, and the forbidden texts of early Christianity, make sure you subscribe to Bible Says. We are on the road to reaching 10,000 subscribers, and your voice, your presence, makes this journey possible. If this video moves you, consider sending a super thanks to support the work we are doing. Every contribution helps us bring these silenced stories to light, stories that have been kept from the world for far too long. And before you continue watching, I have one request. Leave a comment with your name, your city, and the exact time you are watching this video. Let's create a community across the world where these hidden truths are being rediscovered together. Finally, if you want the complete Bible with all 88 books, along with the Book of Enoch translated in English, check the links in the description. These are texts that have been preserved despite the tides of time, and they might just change the way you see everything you thought you knew. The Gospel of Peter begins not with silence, but with a voice that refuses to stay buried. And now, together, we will follow where that voice leads. The story of Peter in the Bible starts on the Galilean coast, where he and his brother Andrew were fishermen. His life appeared routine, synchronized with the tides, until Jesus summoned him to abandon his nets and follow. According to the Gospels, he was impetuous, had a fiery temper, spoke quickly, but also stumbled easily. He is the one who has the courage to leave the boat and venture out onto the water, even if it is only for a short distance before his fear takes over. He is the disciple who boldly declares Jesus to be the Messiah. But shortly after, Jesus chastises him for misinterpreting the meaning of the kingdom and sacrifice. Above all, Peter is one of the most likable characters in Christian history because he personifies the conflict between denial and loyalty, faith and weakness, and strength and weakness. Peter, quote, "'s special position among the disciples is highlighted in the canonical story. His prominence is indicated by the fact that he is frequently listed first when they are named. Jesus gives him the name Cephas, which means rock, and declares that he will build his church on it. For centuries, this statement has been construed as the basis for authority, especially in traditions that link Peter to the founding of the church in Rome. His assertion that Jesus is the Christ solidifies his reputation as a leader and spokesperson, and becomes a pivotal point in the Gospels. However, the same Peter who exhibits unwavering faith is also the one who, while warming himself by the high priest's courtyard fire out of fear, denies Jesus 3 times during his trial. His story is interwoven with this contrast, deep human weakness juxtaposed with profound courage. Following his resurrection, Peter's journey is continued in the Acts of the Apostles, where he is portrayed as a key figurehead of the early church. He announces to the assembled crowds that the Spirit has been poured out, acting as the voice at Pentecost. Through his vision of the clean and unclean animals, he heals, challenges religious leaders, and ultimately becomes the person who first welcomes Gentiles into the community. Peter is shaped by these events as a link between the Jesus movement's Jewish origins and its globalization. He represents both a daring leap into the future and continuity with the past, standing at the cusp of change. According to the canonical tradition, Peter is the shepherd selected to tend to the flock following Jesus' departure, and his authority is based on both his own shortcomings and his eventual recovery. However, there is another Peter, one who appears in works outside of the New Testament canon that coexists with this well-known portrait. These apocryphal texts, which are frequently ascribed to his name, depict Peter in ways that are very different from the well-known picture. Some early Christian ideas that were influential in some communities but were later suppressed or labeled heretical are revealed in works such as the Acts of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, and the Gospel of Peter. Peter is portrayed in these writings as a visionary, martyr, and bearer of hidden revelations, in addition to being a disciple and leader. They point to a more nuanced and contentious recollection of the man known as the Rock. For example, a different version of Jesus' trial and resurrection can be found in the Gospel of Peter. In addition to including amazing details like a talking cross that emerges from the tomb, it presents Pilate as less guilty and places more of the blame on Jewish authorities. Although this gospel emphasizes the resurrection's cosmic significance, it also establishes Peter as a crucial eyewitness to these events, extending his significance beyond the purview of the canonical Gospels. In contrast, the Book of Acts recounts his missionary travels and eventual martyrdom in Rome, where he famously requests to be crucified upside down because he believes he is not worthy of dying the same way as his Lord. Despite having origins outside of the canonical record, this act of humility became a defining feature of Peter's legacy in the minds of later Christians. Another viewpoint is offered by Peter's Apocalypse, which contains striking images of heaven and hell. It presents Peter as the object of in-depth revelations regarding the destiny of souls, complete with vivid descriptions of reward and punishment. Although this text was eventually removed from the canon, it once carried a lot of weight in some Christian communities and was even read aloud in some churches. Its focus on moral responsibility and judgment in the afterlife demonstrates how Peter's name had the power to support a wide range of theological concepts, from radical asceticism to conceptions of cosmic justice. The distinctions between the apocryphal and canonical. Peter revealed power struggles within early Christianity over which voices would define orthodoxy, in addition to differing theological emphases. Peter the Rock, the repentant leader who was restored by Jesus and given the responsibility of leading the community, was highlighted by the church that prevailed in forming the canon. Particularly in Rome, this Peter served as the cornerstone of ecclesiastical authority. As their writings were judged too contentious, too disturbing, or too different from the theological line that became established in the 4th century, the alternative Peters, the visionary, the apocalyptic seer, the radical martyr, were gradually marginalized. The conflict between the silenced and the accepted arises from this contrast. A symbol of authority, consistency, and stability is the canonical Peter. His restoration is hope for the weak, and his failures are lessons. However, the apocryphal Peter shows the creativity of communities who saw him as a vehicle for disconcerting revelations, challenging visions, or criticisms of authority. Though filtered through various prisms, influenced by the needs and beliefs of those who remembered him, both figures refer to the same historical figure. These alternative Peters were silenced for political reasons as well as theological reasons. Leaders had to suppress some stories and elevate others in order to create a single cohesive church. Peter the Rock, a representation of unwavering authority and continuity, was essential to that story. Peter the radical martyr whose upside-down crucifixion challenged imperial power, or Peter the apocalyptic visionary who unlocked cosmic mysteries, threatened to undermine that unity. Part of the purpose of the canon's boundaries was to keep Peter's memory within parameters that suited the church's developing organizational framework. Nevertheless, the lost texts serve as a reminder that memory is never unique. The number of canonical and apocryphal texts that contain Peter's name demonstrates how important he was to early Christianity's imagination. He might be seen as a martyr who reversed the cross, a weak man transformed into a strong one, a fisherman turned leader, or a visionary of heaven. His life served as a blank canvas onto which communities painted their most profound queries regarding revelation, suffering, faith, and authority. Instead of diminishing the man, Peter's multiplicity highlights how significantly he influenced The Christian narrative both within and outside of the canon. Therefore, the story of Peter is about the disputed memory of Jesus' legacy as well as a man who walked with him. According to the canonical Bible, he served as the cornerstone and pillar upon which the church was constructed. A more disturbing image emerges from the lost texts, though one in which Peter is a martyr who challenges authority, a voice of cosmic visions and a person whose authority could sanction opposing theologies. The history of Christianity itself is contained between these two portraits. It tells the tale of the Peter who was silenced and the Peter who was embraced, of what was remembered and what was purposefully forgotten. The field of biblical studies was rocked by a discovery made in the Egyptian sands in the last years of the 19th century. Archaeologists discovered a tomb containing a long-forgotten manuscript in the city of Akhmim during the winter of 1886-1887. A papyrus codex containing a work credited to none other than Peter, a close disciple of Jesus, stood out among the fragments of ancient writings. This book, later known as the Gospel of Peter, came out of the early centuries of Christianity like a ghost, bearing a mystery that both the church and academics who focused on studying sacred history were uneasy about. Just having Peter's name on it sparked intense discussions about heresy, authority, and authenticity. There was an air of eeriness about the discovery site itself. The codex was discovered lying with the remains of a monk, as though it had been purposefully preserved for discovery by a future generation. This document had been sealed away for over 1,000 years by the desert's unforgiving climate, which prevented it from deteriorating, even as entire empires rose and fell over its resting place. The men who first saw the papyrus realized they were looking at something that could change how people understood the origins of Christianity when they unrolled it and deciphered its faded Greek letters. Although it was brief, the tone of the text was different from that of the well-known Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There were echoes of the canonical tradition in its voice, but there were also hints of something new and bolder. The Passion of Jesus was told in dramatic fashion in the Gospel itself. There were sections in it that were shocking in their details and shocking in their imagery. The crucifixion, for example, was depicted in a way that intensified the impression of divine power invading the material world. In one of its most well-known passages, the resurrection was not merely declared, but rather vividly and almost supernaturally described. A talking, walking Jesus, rising from the tomb with a massive cross, as though the wood itself had come to life to bear witness. Such imagery carried the undeniable weight of a tradition that once prevailed among some early Christian communities, even though it was alien to the restrained tone of the canonical texts. This manuscript at once aroused interest and concern. It was a priceless resource for academics, providing a clear window into the range of opinions that once fought to explain the significance of Jesus' life and death. But it was problematic for the institutional church. Writings outside of the established canon of Scripture have been viewed with extreme suspicion since the 4th century. Anything that deviated from orthodoxy but claimed apostolic authority was labeled dangerous. The Gospel of Peter appeared to fit right into that category. Its very existence pushed the limits of what was deemed appropriate Christian memory. The academic response was prompt. The text was analyzed by Greek experts who noted its style and contrasted it with other early works. Some suggested that it was written in the 2nd century by groups of people who respected Peter rather than by him. Others contended that it maintained even older customs that had been altered or suppressed by the canonical Gospels. It became evident that this document could not be written off as a late invention or simple forgery. Even though its provenance was still unclear, it had the hallmarks of authenticity and antiquity. Meanwhile, the Church proceeded with caution. It was disturbing to consider that Peter, The rock on which Christianity was supposed to be founded might have left behind a gospel that was different from the four accepted ones. Theologians were concerned that the text's bold claims and vivid storytelling might mislead regular believers. Consequently, copies of the Gospel of Peter were not widely distributed, and it was never given a place in liturgy or worship. Rather than being honored in spiritual practice, it was primarily preserved as a subject of study, confined in scholarly discussions. However, its appeal was only increased by the attempt to marginalize it. The papyrus was translated, published, and its meaning discussed in academic institutions and journals throughout Europe. Its depiction of Jesus, according to some, separated him from human suffering and placed more emphasis on his divine transcendence than the canonical focus on his humanity. Others pointed out the text's anti-Jewish overtones, which implied a polemical setting where early Christians aimed to set themselves apart from their Jewish heritage. These components depicted a community grappling with identity and attempting to defend its version of reality against competing interpretations. The aura of the gospel was enhanced by its enigmatic beginnings. Why had it been interred in Egypt with a monk? Was this a silent act of defiance by someone who felt the church had too narrowed the faith, or was it a faithful preservation of a text that had once been treasured but was later suppressed? The questions remained, but the desert had kept its secrets. Every textual fragment and odd phrase seemed to provide a glimpse into the lost world of early Christianity when conflicting gospels, visions, and revelations were widely shared before orthodoxy's boundaries were established. The findings served as a reminder to religious historians of just how fluid the early centuries of Christianity were. What is now referred to as the New Testament was the result of extensive discussions, omissions, and decisions, rather than being transmitted in its entirety. The Gospel of Peter served as a living example of those overlooked options and a tribute to the voices that were muffled when the canon was established. Despite centuries of suppression, its continued existence into the modern era attested to the tenacity of memory and the impossibility of completely erasing the past. The manuscript sparked fresh looks for other apocryphal works in the years following its discovery. What else might be buried in the sands of Egypt, Syria, or Palestine if Peter's gospel could remain hidden for so long? That query drove expeditions that were financed by affluent backers and led by academics keen to learn more about the obscure past of Christianity. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library were discovered in the ensuing decades, adding to our knowledge of the ancient religious world. However, the Gospel of Peter had, in many respects, opened the door, demonstrating how one lost text could compel people to reconsider their preconceived notions. The Gospel of Peter is still a mystery and a provocative text today. It cannot be written off as irrelevant or neatly incorporated into the canon. Its 1886 discovery was more than just an archaeological finding. It was a challenge to the brittleness of tradition and the unyielding tenacity of alternative voices. In addition to being an ancient text, the fragile papyrus serves as a somber reminder to those who handle it in museums and archives. Christianity was not a single stream in its early centuries, but rather a river with numerous branches, some of which were severed but never entirely gone. Few could have predicted the impact the opening of the tomb and the pulling of the manuscript into the light that winter in Akhmim would have on faith, history, and theology. However, the words of the Gospel of Peter, written by hands that had long since turned to dust, had waited calmly in silence, preserving a memory that would not die. Not only did it recount the events of Jesus' death and resurrection, but it also testified to the contentious core of Christianity, the conflict over who gets to tell the story and which ones are permitted to survive. When it was read aloud for the first time in more than 1,000 years, we enter a familiar yet unnerving world when we enter the passion narrative of the Gospel of Peter. The events of betrayal, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection that we are familiar with from the canonical Gospels are mirrored in it, but they are reframed to show a completely different perspective. This apocryphal story, which was probably written in the 2nd century but echoes customs from the late 1st century, portrays Jesus' last hours as an almost untouchable drama in which his divine nature shines through human frailty rather than as a period of agony. It makes us reevaluate how early Christians pondered the significance of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. The portrayal of suffering itself is one of the most notable differences between the Gospel of Peter and the canonical stories. Jesus is portrayed as completely experiencing human suffering in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The story revolves around his cries of abandonment, his thirst, the scourging, and the suffering of the cross. The Passion is centered on Jesus' unadulterated human suffering, particularly in Mark's account. However, this emphasis is completely changed in the Gospel of Peter. It depicts a Jesus who appears to be above suffering, unaffected by agony even, during his execution. This illustrates a docetic tendency, a view that was prevalent in some early Christian communities, that Jesus did not actually experience physical pain, only the appearance of it. This doctrinal interpretation separates Jesus from the frailty of death and positions him as a heavenly being whose divinity overshadows any hint of weakness. The story doesn't linger on cries or agony when the nails are driven into his skin. Jesus, instead, comes across as calm, his body less like a person burdened by pain and more like a vessel going through the motions of execution. The Jesus of the Gospel of Peter is more of a divine apparition than a man of sorrows, more of a transcendent spirit than a suffering servant. Many Orthodox leaders of the time were uneasy with this viewpoint because it ran the risk of denying the central tenet of the Incarnation, which is that God actually experienced human life, including pain and death. Herod's role in this story is another oddity. The Roman ruler who condemned Jesus is revealed in the canonical Gospels as Pontius Pilate. Rome bears ultimate responsibility, even though the Jewish leaders are portrayed as exerting pressure for his demise. This dynamic is drastically changed in the Gospel of Peter. Herod is the one who plans the crucifixion, while Pilate is released from the main role and is shown to be hesitant and even reluctant. It shifts the blame directly to Jewish authorities, especially Herod, and away from the Roman governor. This is a significant shift that has both political and theological underpinnings. Christians frequently encountered conflicts with Roman authority in the decades following Jesus' death. The Gospel of Peter may have been trying to shift the focus of animosity away from Rome and toward the Jewish leaders' guilt by downplaying Pilate's responsibility. However, this change had unsettling repercussions because it not only changed historical memory, but also fueled an anti-Jewish sentiment that was already on the rise in some Christian communities. The conflict between Jesus and the Jewish authorities is depicted in the canonical Gospels, but Pilate's role as the one who approves the crucifixion remains crucial. By upsetting this equilibrium and shifting the blame elsewhere, the Gospel of Peter transforms the Passion into a tale of Jewish violence and Roman resistance. The imagery in the story becomes more fantastical and even unearthly as it moves closer to the resurrection. In the Gospel of Peter, a dramatic, almost cosmic spectacle is revealed, in contrast to the silent and nearly concealed resurrection scenes in Matthew, Luke, and John, where the women discover the empty tomb and meet angelic messengers. The heavens open, the earth trembles, and the resurrection is revealed in splendor rather than in mystery. a figure of astounding size emerges from the tomb, Jesus himself, not just raised but greatly enlarged. His presence is monumental, surpassing the normal human scale, and his head reaches the heavens. More than just resurrection is depicted in this image. It shows Jesus' elevation as cosmic Lord, looming over creation and expressing victory in overpowering visible form. An even more shocking detail is included with this amazing vision. The cross itself is shown to be speaking and walking. The cross, which remains after Jesus is buried, is described in canonical accounts as the instrument of death, a symbol of brutality and shame. But in Peter's Gospel, the cross is animated, almost personified, to bear witness to the resurrection. It is reported to have risen from the grave alongside Jesus and even to have responded to a voice from heaven. This bizarre scene, which combines symbolic drama with apocalyptic imagery, verges on the mythic. The speaking cross turns the story from history into a visionary revelation. It is a scene intended to proclaim cosmic truth as much as to recite events. For centuries, academics and theologians have been debating the significance of this peculiar imagery. According to some, the walking cross and the giant Jesus are metaphors for victory. The cross is the actual sign of salvation, while Jesus' enlarged form symbolizes his cosmic triumph. Others interpret it as an expression of early Christian imagination that was unrestrained by historical memory, and instead leaned toward the language of symbols and visions. In any event, the scene of the resurrection in the Gospel of Peter demonstrates how various groups attempted to explain the core mystery of Christianity. The Gospel of Peter takes the event to a cosmic level, whereas the canonical Gospels emphasize the closeness of encounters with the risen Christ. Mary Magdalene in the garden, the disciples in the locked room, a window into the diversity of early Christian thought is provided by this story's docetic coloring, shift of blame to Herod, and imagery of the apocalyptic resurrection. Jesus' suffering might have seemed less significant than his victory to the community that upheld and treasured this gospel. It's possible that his transcendent power overshadowed his humanity. His resurrection was a spectacle for both heaven and earth, not a whispered event at dawn. The difficulties and queries that believers have when attempting to understand how Jesus' death fits into their conception of God and salvation are reflected in this retelling. However, it was precisely this uniqueness that caused mainstream Christianity to reject it. Because of its doctrinal overtones, church leaders like Serapion of Antioch denounced the Gospel of Peter as heretical, denying the fullness of the incarnation. The notion that God took on human form and accepted the human condition in all its complexity would be equivalent to denying that Jesus actually suffered. It ran the risk of warping history and fostering negative sentiments to exonerate Pilate and increase Jewish guilt. Presenting the resurrection as a mythical event was a departure from the early witnesses' more subdued accounts. The Gospel of Peter nevertheless serves as a potent reminder of the wide range of early Christian traditions. It demonstrates that the Passion was never a straightforward tale told in a single voice, but rather a mystery that early Christians found difficult to explain in a variety of ways. Some saw it as a story of human redemption and divine suffering. Others saw it as a matter of cosmic triumph and transcendence. In this alternate story, we see a Jesus who is painless, a Herod who is burdened with guilt, and a resurrection that trembles the heavens, with even the cross coming to life to declare what words cannot. When Peter's words are extracted from the bits that remain, they bear the weight of a man who dared to speak out against empires while walking in their shadow. His voice is not one of compromise, rather it is full of a strong belief that justice is God's domain and cannot be influenced by powerful people. the echoes of a fisherman who shivered before soldiers but later stood boldly before rulers, declaring that truth is not bound by decrees and that the downtrodden are closer to the heart of heaven than kings on their thrones, can be heard in the shards of his teachings. The kingdom of God could not be built with the bricks of empire, nor could it be silenced with chains and prisons, he said, with a clarity that both priests and governors found unsettling. Because it excluded the divine from the purview of institutional authority, Peter's message was perilous. Peter maintained that only God owned life, and that death had been vanquished in Christ, in contrast to Rome's assertion that it controlled both life and death. This was a radical rejection of the structures that benefited from violence, fear, and submission, not a nebulous spiritual consolation. The scaffolding of worldly control shook when Peter preached, because he explained to the poor that their lack of resources was a sign of solidarity with the Messiah, who had nowhere to rest, rather than a sign of a divine curse. He explained to the slaves that, in the Creator's view, their souls were free and not owned by their owners. He warned those in positions of power that their wealth would vanish like dust, and that the truth they attempted to bury would reappear with the same unstoppable vigor as the resurrection. His teachings are most notable for their active challenge, rather than their passive hope. He challenged believers to do more than just put up with injustice. He cited Jesus' overturning of tables in the temple as evidence that followers should be just as daring in their own lives. For Peter, being holy meant refusing to remain silent in the face of deception, never separating oneself from the pain of others. His words brought faith down from the clouds and rooted it in the cries of strangers, widows, and orphans who were frequently marginalized in society. He described truth as a flame that could not be extinguished, rather than a delicate philosophy. Being true meant living a risky life, exposing the lies that empire passed off as law and the deceit that power passed off as order. Peter quote, "A steadfast resistance to the manipulation of faith by those vying for power was the most radical element of his message." He observed how religious leaders frequently sided with Rome, disguising their deference to the empire under the guise of custom and power. Peter criticized this as betrayal, saying that comfort or security cannot be exchanged for God's truth. That refusal was reflected in his own life. He endured beatings, imprisonments, and threats repeatedly, but he always came out of them with words that were sharper than ever and unwavering in his testimony that the Spirit of God does not submit to earthly thrones. His teachings thus transcended all containment efforts. These lessons still have a strong hold on the current battles for justice and the truth. Peter's remarks continue to rage in a society where wealth distorts the truth, where fear is employed as a tool of control, and where authority frequently tries to silence dissenting voices. He reminds us that the timeless standard of justice, which is impervious to bribery and intimidation, defines truth, not those who hold microphones or issue decrees. People today embody the same spirit that blazed in Peter's heart when they oppose corrupt systems and risk their comfort to speak for those who lack a voice. His message transcends the ages and becomes a living example of the need for courage for anyone claiming to be a follower of Christ. Peter quote, "S teachings also strongly oppose the propensity to divorce faith from day-to-day hardships. Religion is all too frequently portrayed as a means of escape, as if it only belonged in ceremonial settings rather than on the streets where injustice is rampant." Peter dispels that delusion. He establishes his faith in the governor's court, the jail cell, the marketplace, and the cramped dwellings of the impoverished. His example demonstrates that spirituality is not timid, but defiant, engaged rather than withdrawn. He believed that to love God meant to oppose deception, to love one's neighbor meant to protect them from abuse, and to share the gospel meant to reveal the structures that undermine the human spirit. Because it reminds the oppressed that they serve a higher king and dispels the myth that their power is absolute, his message has always unnerved rulers. Upon closer inspection, we can see that Peter's radical voice was always about liberation, rather than destruction. He advocated for a fierce fidelity to truth that would expose the lies of the powerful, rather than inciting hatred or retaliation. He advocated forgiving others without sacrificing justice. He advocated for peace, but it was never won based on quiet or acquiescence in unfair treatment. His message endures because it strikes a balance between being merciful and unyielding, fiery and compassionate. He saw a society in which everyone was treated equally before God, where no one's voice could be silenced by wealth or fear, and where each person's inherent worth was protected. Readers today cannot deny how relevant Peter's teachings are to current issues, such as calls for economic exploitation, racial justice movements, opposition to authoritarian governments, and the need for truth in a time of disinformation. The spirit of Peter's message is stirred in each of these. He would not allow us to withdraw into neutrality or silence. The convenient lie that faith is limited to private devotion is something he would not have us believe. Rather, he would exhort us to face the public square and engage in the messy, expensive, and risky task of standing up for what is right, even when the world says otherwise. His remarks may still be unsettling because of this. They test our willingness to resist the subtle temptations of power that infiltrate even religious institutions, to risk comfort and reputation for truth, and to carry the same courage. We can't stay safe because of his voice. It forces us to confront lies, stand in solidarity with the oppressed, and live a life that is more passionate than making concessions. And even though centuries have gone by and empires have come and gone, Peter's challenge is still as relevant today as it was when he first stood in front of the ruling class and said, "We must obey God rather than men." One of the most vivid and disturbing depictions of the crucifixion can be found in the Nag Hammadi text's Gnostic apocalypse of Peter. It is neither a cozy narrative intended to reassure the faithful nor the version of events that the official church preserved. Rather, it presents us with an unsettling image, one in which truth is concealed beneath outward appearances. According to this text, Peter, the disciple who frequently found it difficult to comprehend Jesus during his earthly life, received a revelation of startling significance, that the crucifixion, as it was seen by the masses, was not what it appeared to be. Peter sees two figures in this vision, one who is suffering and being ridiculed while nailed to the cross, and another who is radiant and unharmed, standing close by and grinning, because it implies that Jesus' physical suffering was not the ultimate reality, and that the true Christ was out of the grasp of the rulers who believed they had vanquished him. This paradoxical image upends the core of traditional Christian belief. There is a radical message about truth and deceit in this teaching. The world is based on appearances. Those in positions of authority fabricate shows of control by instilling fear and violence in order to hold on to their position of authority. The Roman Empire used crucifixion as a cruel reminder to the oppressed that resistance had unaffordable consequences and as a means of displaying complete control over the human body. However, this display of imperial might is shown to be a fabrication in Peter's vision. The rulers are unable to touch the divine spirit that exists outside of matter, but they can affix flesh to wood. The smiling Christ figure ridicules their purported authority and reveals the pointlessness of their violence. Peter witnesses an unveiling rather than a defeat, a realization that lies are the foundation of worldly power, and that no matter how violent the effort, truth cannot be destroyed. The perils of religious leadership itself are also cautioned about in the Apocalypse of Peter. False leaders in the nascent church exploit faith to gain power, much like the Romans use violence to instill fear. The book warns against people who use religious terminology to support the very oppressive forces they say they oppose. They are the ones who pride themselves on external rituals, who align themselves with political interests, and who, rather than fostering liberation, demand obedience. Their guises are stripped away by Peter's vision, which reveals them as corrupt agents posing as the people's shepherds. In this sense, the text discusses not only the cruelty of Rome, but also the compromises and distortions that can occur when leaders put control over the truth. This work's insistence on a faith based on inner truth and vision, rather than external forms, is what makes it so difficult. The reader is challenged to see past outward manifestations in the Apocalypse of Peter, similar to how Christ's crucifixion appeared to demonstrate his death, but actually demonstrated his transcendence. Corrupt leaders' actions can appear holy, but actually be a cover for emptiness. Peter believes that the risk is in confusing the apparent with the actual. Institutions without truth, authority without justice, and rituals without spirit all turn into bonds rather than avenues for liberation. This writing has an unmistakably Gnostic tone. Knowledge and awakening to the reality hidden beneath the shadows are the paths to salvation. A larger conflict in early Christianity between conflicting ideas about what it meant to follow Jesus is also reflected in Peter's vision. Communities that prioritized participation in sacraments, unity under church authority, and obedience to bishops as outward manifestations of belonging were on one side. Groups such as those represented at Nag Hammadi, on the other hand, placed a strong emphasis on direct knowledge of God, personal revelation, and opposition to any framework that subordinated spiritual truth to human authority. The latter group includes the Apocalypse of Peter, which offers a critique of the early church's institutionalizing inclinations. The text addresses a timeless truth by depicting false leaders as blind guides guiding the blind, illustrating how easily faith can be perverted when used to further social or political power. We are also prompted to consider how truth endures under oppression by the imagery of two Christs, one suffering and the other triumphant. The world may believe that the powerful always prevail, that justice is always upheld, and that the voices of the oppressed and impoverished are always silenced. However, Peter's vision maintains that this is merely a fleeting appearance. Truth remains unaltered beneath the surface, even grinning at the hubris of those who believe they can destroy it. This becomes a reminder to all generations that injustice is never the last word, as well as a theological and political statement. The deeper reality belongs to those who stand with truth, and what seems to be a victory for corruption is merely an illusion. Such a message strikes a deep chord with contemporary issues. The warnings in the Apocalypse of Peter seem eerily relevant in a world where religious leaders frequently exploit religion for their own ends, and where hierarchies of power pose as moral defenders. We still see false shepherds who side with the powers of this world, who use faith as a tool to control rather than as a means of emancipation. Similar to Peter's time, there are spectacles that conceal the underlying injustices at play in order to divert attention and mislead, whether through political theater, the media, or religious showmanship. The vision tests our ability to discern, to look past outward manifestations, and to identify the true nature of truth. Another way to consider resiliency in the face of adversity is through the Apocalypse of Peter. One is tempted to think that truth itself has been crucified when movements for justice are stifled, voices are silenced, and leaders of integrity are attacked. In contrast, the smiling figure in Peter's vision serves as a reminder that truth is unbreakable. The deeper spirit endures, untouchable by those with earthly power, even when bodies are broken. Today's activists, intellectuals, and seekers find this to be a potent symbol of hope that inspires perseverance in the face of adversity. However, passive acceptance is not permitted in the text. This vision is not given to Peter merely for consolation. Rather, it calls his attention to the continuous fight against deception, both within and outside the religious community. According to the Apocalypse, one must protect the truth, identify corruption, and resist the allure of outward appearances. This is still a radical and urgent lesson for people who live in societies where falsehoods are passed off as fact and where religious organizations frequently support injustice. The Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter ultimately presents its readers with a decision to follow the obvious or to look for the hidden, to have faith in institutions or in vision, to submit to material authority or to stand for the unalterable truth that no crucifixion can destroy. Its radical reworking of the crucifixion redefines faith itself, not just rewriting history. Faith transforms into brave discernment rather than mindless obedience, into freedom from authority rather than submission to it, and from conformity to appearances to an awakening to reality. According to Peter, the crucifixion is not the conclusion of the tale, but rather the moment when illusion is exposed and truth is shown to be impervious to corruption. All who dare to look past the obvious and pursue the deeper reality that upholds justice and life are continually unsettled, challenged, and inspired by this vision. The apocalyptic dialogue in the letter of Peter to Philip, which has been preserved among the Nag Hammadi writings, sheds light on the difficulties faced by the early followers of Christ as they looked for direction during periods of spiritual uncertainty, fear, and persecution. There is a sense of urgency at the outset, as Philip seeks assistance amid a formidable spiritual and material struggle. Peter answers with a vision of leadership based on fortitude, discernment, and divine truth, rather than just offering assurance. This text captures the precarious state of a community struggling with doubt, oppression, and the difficulty of remaining faithful while surrounded by forces determined to silence them. In contrast to the polished doctrines of institutional Christianity, it feels raw and unguarded. The conversation reveals the spiritual conflict that underlies persecution and exhorts the apostles to hold fast to the secret knowledge that has been entrusted to them despite their near-death experience. The letter's structure is profoundly apocalyptic, portraying history as a stage on which events are directed by invisible spiritual forces. The apostles are battling cosmic forces of ignorance, darkness, and deceit that work through human systems rather than just antagonistic rulers or social rejection. Peter presents himself as an advisor who is able to read these difficulties as indications of a greater drama in which perseverance is crucial rather than as sporadic bad luck. This makes the letter read more like a spiritual manifesto for a persecuted movement than it does like a personal letter. Its goal is to provide readers with perspective and remind them that their suffering is a sign that they are part of a larger struggle that goes beyond earthly bounds, rather than to answer all of their questions. This text's emphasis on the apostles' frailty is among its most striking features. The letter of Peter to Philip presents them in a very human light, questioning, hesitating, and fearing for their lives, in contrast to later church writings that depict them as unflinching pillars of strength. The dialogue is relatable because of its candor, which admits that even Christ's closest friends experience confusion when faced with violence and hopelessness. But Peter's ability to speak as a voice of endurance is made possible by this very weakness. Instead of asserting his superiority, he acts as a conduit for wisdom that transcends their current anxieties. His function as a guide exemplifies a larger Gnostic theme. Salvation requires greater understanding and the guts to act on it rather than blind faith. The main factor that keeps believers going through hardships is hidden wisdom, according to the text. Only those with eyes to see and ears to hear can access this wisdom. The apostles' suffering may appear pointless to the outside world, but in the divine plan, it shows a way to triumph over corruption and ignorance. Peter maintains that the community must look inward and access the divine spark that resides within them, which links them directly to the source of truth rather than depending on external indicators or institutional frameworks to stay strong. This radical idea reroutes power to the believer's inner life and undercuts dependence on external authorities, whether they be political or religious. Persecution turns into a teacher as well as a test. The difficulties mentioned in the dialogue are not coincidental. Rather, they are a necessary component of the process of refining that reveals hidden wisdom. The apostles' perseverance shows that their faith is a living force that cannot be crushed by chains or put out by death, rather than a brittle ornament. The letter encourages its readers to view suffering as evidence of being chosen to resist the powers of deception, rather than as an indication of abandonment. In this way, the text turns hopelessness into a kind of spiritual privilege, a way to take part in the cosmic struggle that determines the world's fate. However, the letter also serves as a stark cautionary tale about deceptive leaders and twisted religious interpretations. Peter's voice is unwavering in its call for discernment in a world where persecution has dispersed believers and left them open to exploitation. He cautions that many will arrive with simple solutions or misguided doctrines that seem safe, but actually push people further into the shadows. True believers must be able to withstand persecution not only physically, but also intellectually and spiritually. This part of the letter highlights the need for each believer to challenge and protect what they believe to be true, while also expressing skepticism toward outside authorities. Refusing to give up their secret knowledge to manipulation is just as important to the community's survival as avoiding physical death. A feeling of closeness among the apostles is also reflected in the letter's tone. As if they are huddled together in the shadows, trying to find clarity in the midst of chaos, the dialogue depicts their shared struggle. The communal aspect of their endurance is further reinforced by Peter's presence as a guiding figure. They are united in shared responsibility and are not left to face hardships alone. This representation captures an early Christian idea of unity based on shared access to divine wisdom and mutual support rather than institutional hierarchy. This idea of a spiritual family fighting together against insurmountable obstacles is furthered by the apostles' assembly in prayer and their joint intercession. The letter's apocalyptic tone pulls the reader into a larger cosmic horizon and away from the immediate historical setting. The conflict between the forces of light and darkness is used to reframe the apostles' fear of persecution by human rulers. Peter's reassurance serves as a reminder to them that the hidden truth they carry is eternal, while the material world, with all its violence and corruption, is fleeting. The apostles' outlook is changed from one of despair to one of endurance as a result of this viewpoint. Their perseverance will outlast the forces that rise against them, not that persecution will end soon. Instead of passive resignation, the endurance required is an active engagement with truth, a refusal to allow ignorance to determine the meaning of their suffering. Christ's own teachings are echoed throughout the text, especially in its emphasis on tenacity, caution, and the peril of false shepherds. The letter of Peter to Philip, however, presents these concepts in the language of cosmic conflict and hidden knowledge, in contrast to the more well-known gospel stories. It is more focused on helping people realize their direct connection to divine wisdom than it is on maintaining institutional order. This firmly situates the letter within the Gnostic tradition, which frequently aimed to reinterpret Christian teachings in ways that prioritized individual spiritual awakening and resisted outside control. The letter skillfully combines fear, wisdom, and endurance in its apocalyptic dialogue to create a survival narrative for a besieged community. Peter gives the apostles a vision that turns their suffering into a sign of divine purpose, but he does not promise them an easy way out or instant relief. Their misunderstanding turns into a chance for greater comprehension. Their frailty turns into a platform for the power of latent wisdom. The message is relevant not only to its initial audience, but also to everyone who is torn between the pressures of persecution and the demands of faith. It demands intellectual and spiritual endurance, one that withstands corruption, holds fast to truth that is hidden, and perseveres until light reveals the forces that appear invincible at this point. The struggle for the faith was not limited to external forces like Roman emperors or hostile cultural environments, as becomes evident when we travel back in time to the turbulent centuries of early Christianity. Within the movement itself, it was just as, if not more, contentious. Debates over whose voices would define Christianity for future generations shaped the conflict between the canonical writings and those deemed heretical. This storm of controversy swept through the works ascribed to Peter, including the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Peter, and other apocryphal writings. They were suppressed because they represented a line of thought that challenged the nascent hierarchies of power in the church, not necessarily because they lacked spiritual worth. Knowing why these books were rejected tells us a lot about how the Bible's canon was created and why some Christian ideas survived while others were suppressed. The Christian canon was not created in a single straightforward moment. Over several centuries, it was a slow and frequently disorganized process. Writings that spoke to various communities and represented a variety of viewpoints were distributed by early Christians in the form of teachings, apocalypses, letters, and gospels. Some texts, like the Gospel of Matthew or the letters of Paul, were revered and read by many. Others were practically unknown in some places, but revered in others. The issue of which writings had actual apostolic authority became pressing by the 2nd century. Church leaders looked for a standard collection that could bring doctrine and practice together because there were so many conflicting viewpoints. Bishops and councils actively shaped consensus by praising some texts and condemning others, rather than just reflecting it. With audacious claims, the Gospel of Peter and associated apocryphal works entered this field. According to the canonical Gospels, they bore the name of the apostle who was selected to serve as the rock upon which Christ's church would be erected. They were strong candidates in the fight for legitimacy because of this affiliation. However, their content frequently deviated in unsettling ways from the expanding orthodoxy. The Church's insistence on the incarnation as fully human and fully divine clashed with the docetic overtones of the Gospel of Peter, which claimed that Jesus did not actually suffer in the flesh. Similar to this, the Apocalypse of Peter caused theological tensions by providing details and interpretations that later councils deemed too speculative or at odds with the developing doctrines of judgment and resurrection. This was due to its disturbing visions of the afterlife. Irenaeus of Lyons, Tertullian of Carthage, and Origen of Alexandria were among the early church fathers who positioned themselves as defenders of the faith. Their writings demonstrate a profound concern over the spread of unchecked doctrine among believers. For them, Christianity was a body of truth that needed to be carefully protected from distortion rather than just a collection of motivational tales. Specifically, Irenaeus cautioned against false gospels, which he felt misled Christians. His book, Against Heresies, focused more on reducing internal diversity than it did on disproving external opponents. He believed that the internal division of Christianity into rival sects posed a greater threat than merely pagan persecution. Texts like the Gospel of Peter became dangerous in this context, not only because of their ideas, but also because of the authority they claimed by using Peter's name. It is important to realize that calling a text heretical was a political act as well as a theological judgment. Determining who was inside and who was outside, what was safe to believe and what was not, was necessary for the consolidation of church authority. Church fathers bolstered their claim to represent the true apostolic tradition by condemning certain writings as heretical. It was feared that believers would split into innumerable groups lacking a common doctrine if too many conflicting writings were permitted to spread unchecked. By drawing clear boundaries, the councils that ultimately codified the canon, such as the Council of Carthage in 397 and the Synod of Hippo in 393, sought to put an end to this instability. Writings such as those ascribed to Peter that did not fit into the selected collection were at risk of being suppressed, and their impact was progressively removed from the popular narrative of Christianity. Peter, quote, "S. apocryphal writings sparked a great deal of opposition, which is further explained by their radical nature. They frequently included components that questioned established authority and material power. The Gospel of Peter, for instance, shifted the narrative of responsibility in ways that challenged conventional interpretations by placing more blame on Herod than Pilate. In Peter's Apocalypse, oppressors and elites were depicted suffering alongside common sinners in visions of justice that transcended conventional social boundaries. Although these depictions struck a chord with marginalized communities, they posed a threat to leaders who wanted theological clarity that would serve larger political objectives or who sought harmony with Roman structures. These texts' popularity among people unhappy with the concessions made by the institutional church is demonstrated by the fact that they were kept secret for centuries. There was reason to be concerned about the spread of unchecked teachings. Christianity was spreading quickly throughout many languages and cultures. The faith ran the risk of breaking up into innumerable regional variations in the absence of clear boundaries. According to one viewpoint, the suppression of apocryphal literature ensured a common basis of belief and was an act of preservation. From a different perspective, it was a form of silence, severing voices that might have provided different perspectives on Jesus, the apostles, and the religious path. This dichotomy, the need for unity on the one hand and the expense of excluding radical or unsettling viewpoints on the other, is reflected in the dispute over Peter's writings. It is remarkable how frequently the Church Fathers used danger to frame their opposition. Heretical writings were referred to as wolves in the flock, poison, or infection. Their fear of both theological error and losing control over the faith's narrative is evident in such language. Internal cohesion was necessary for the Church to survive in a hostile world, and exclusion was necessary for cohesion. However, the force of the opposition itself implies that the apocryphal texts had an irresistible force. They wouldn't have sparked such harsh criticisms if they were unimportant or unimportant. The tension between institutional and living faith is also brought to light by this conflict. It's possible that the early communities that valued Peter's alternative gospels saw Christianity more as a living conversation with divine truth than as a set of regulations. In contrast, the goal of the councils and church fathers was to establish a solid foundation that would stand the test of time. The development of Christianity included both impulses, the stability of canon and the freedom of radical voices. However, the conflict made it certain that one would rule and the other would be cast into the background. The world was reminded of what had been lost even centuries later when pieces of these texts were discovered again in monastic libraries or the sands of Egypt. They disclose a Christianity that was formerly far more radical, disputed and varied than the one that is upheld by official doctrine. Even though the early church fathers were successful in defining orthodoxy, the fact that Peter's apocryphal writings have survived and are still in existence shows that silenced voices can still be heard throughout history. The Christian world was far from unified when Constantine came to power in the 4th century. Christ followers were dispersed throughout large geographic areas, adhering to various customs, conserving a variety of texts, and having conflicting ideas about Jesus' identity and mission. The disarray of doctrine and writing endangered not only the unity of the new religion, but also the stability of the empire Constantine aimed to establish under his control. He saw Christianity as a potential tool for bringing people together politically, not just as a matter of faith. However, the religion required a set of tenets and texts that could be accepted in all of the regions ruled by Rome before it could fulfill that function. Here, Constantine's intervention changed the trajectory of biblical history because his resources and power allowed for the production of an official Bible that took imperial interests and theological concerns into account. Local Christian communities read a wide range of texts before Constantine. While some regarded the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as important, others placed equal weight on works such as the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of Peter, and the Gospel of Thomas. Different apostles wrote letters and revelations, were documented in a variety of ways. Texts like the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Apocalypse of Peter were regarded as extremely spiritual and authoritative in some circles. Early Christians were more concerned with the immediacy of faith and lived experience than they were with centralized control, so they were less bothered by the lack of uniformity than later generations would be. However, as the movement grew, theological disagreements increased, and it became increasingly important to determine which texts actually represented divine inspiration. Constantine realized that his empire could never be held together by a disjointed religion. His well-known conversion and subsequent support of Christianity resulted from a strategic plan to capitalize on its expanding influence in addition to his own personal devotion. He started a process that would define theological orthodoxy and open the door to a standardized canon by calling the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Bishops at Nicaea argued over whether Christ was entirely human, entirely divine, or a combination of the two. However, authority was the fundamental issue. Scriptures that contradict that vision could be marginalized if Christ's identity could be definitively established, enabling the Church to advance a cohesive body of writings. These discussions were heavily influenced by Roman politics. The creation of Bibles was funded by Constantine, who most famously ordered 50 copies for the Constantinople churches. The theological stances supported at Nicaea and later councils were reflected in these texts, which did not just appear by chance. Silently excluded were works considered radical, particularly those that questioned hierarchical structures. With its focus on private, confidential knowledge, the Gospel of Thomas ran counter to the Church's expanding institutional authority. The idea that a woman could have spiritual authority on par with, or even higher than that of the apostles was proposed in the Gospel of Mary, which was dangerous for the male-dominated hierarchy. Jesus' crucifixion was portrayed in the Gospel of Peter in ways that contradicted the then emerging theory of atonement, and its suggestion that the Jews were to blame for his demise ran the risk of escalating tensions that the empire sought to maintain. The councils narrowed the scope of acceptable belief by designating such works as heretical, thereby bringing scripture into line with political necessity. Rome, quote, S. intervention made sure that theology was now a matter of statecraft, as well as divine inspiration. The empire needed a controllable religion to maintain order, and control necessitated a set canon. Freely distributing a variety of texts would have given local communities the ability to understand faith for themselves, spawning competing movements outside the purview of bishops who were allies of Rome. Therefore, the suppression of alternative gospels was both theological and calculated. The power of the emperor, who depended on Christianity as well as the church hierarchy, would have been threatened by a Christianity characterized by mystical visions, female leadership, or anti-institutional teachings. This arrangement was advantageous to the bishops themselves. The episcopal class strengthened its control over the faithful with imperial support. Their position as the defenders of truth was strengthened by their doctrinal uniformity, and they used the canon as a tool to distinguish between heresy and orthodoxy. Councils, frequently without much leeway, determined what was safe to read and what was harmful. Radical texts were suppressed because their implications endangered the tenuous alliance between the church and the empire, not necessarily because their content was completely untrue. Bishops' authority was undermined by a gospel that prioritized internal revelation over external authority. The patriarchal structure of the church was upended by a text that questioned conventional gender roles. An interpretation of Jesus' death that was at odds with the evolving theology of salvation ran the risk of splintering the message Constantine needed to bring his empire together. As a result, the Bible represented the balance of power in addition to spiritual truth. Constantine's desire for unity influenced the circumstances surrounding the finalization of the canon, even though he did not personally choose every book. Decisions regarding scripture had repercussions that extended well beyond the boundaries of the church, and theological discussions were inextricably linked to political pressures. The Bible became a weapon of imperial unity as a result of Rome's influence reaching into the core of religion. Whether they were Gnostic communities, Montanists, or communities that preserved apocryphal texts, those who opposed were marginalized, labeled heretics, and ultimately silenced. However, remnants of these struggles are still present. The 20th century discovery of materials such as the Nag Hammadi library demonstrated the diversity of early Christianity prior to Constantine's intervention. The alternative visions of Jesus, spirituality, and communal life that once flourished, but were suppressed to safeguard the new hierarchy, are glimpsed in these writings. The extent to which politics influence the faith is demonstrated by their suppression. The current canon is the product of centuries of conflicting interpretations, influenced as much by Rome's political might as by theological reasoning. It is not just the product of divine selection. The intricate relationship between faith and empire is exemplified by Constantine's influence on the official Bible. He guaranteed Christianity's survival and growth by integrating it with Rome's infrastructure, but he also constrained its diversity. What was lost were voices that spoke of equality, freedom, and hidden wisdom. Voices that were silenced not because they lacked spiritual depth, but rather because they posed a threat to the institutions that the bishops and Rome had laboriously built. The suppression of radical gospels shows how the preservation of hierarchy frequently outweighed the preservation of truth, and the cost of unity was exclusion. There is an overwhelming reliance on symbolism that goes beyond the literal in the writings ascribed to Peter, whether in the apocryphal accounts or in later traditions surrounding him. Words were not always taken at face value in those early communities. They had multiple meanings that were intended to uplift the faithful and defend the neighborhood from evil forces. The representation of a giant Jesus and the amazing image of a talking cross stand out as two of the most daring of these symbolic motifs. Although these symbols may appear ridiculous or exaggerated to an outsider, they had great meaning in the cultural and religious context of their day. They pointed to cosmic truths that could not be sufficiently conveyed by traditional language, embodying realities that transcended human comprehension. In certain apocryphal traditions, Jesus is portrayed as a tall, enormous figure that rises from the tomb. This is a theological assertion rather than a literal distortion. The magnitude of Jesus' triumph over death is reflected in his size in these visions. In a time when emperors were portrayed in exaggerated life-size portraits to convey their power over peoples and nations, early Christians used the same imagery to proclaim that Christ was more powerful than Rome. In addition to being a risen Savior, a giant Jesus represented the supremacy of divine cosmic power, surpassing both earthly rulers and political emperors. His size served as a theological and artistic declaration that his rule was universal, spanning empire, geography, and ethnicity. In Peter's visionary accounts, the cross itself was also charged with multiple levels of meaning, as it was described as speaking. The cross represented humiliation, state terror, and final defeat to Roman authorities. It symbolized the stifling force of empire, turning its opponents into anonymous, tortured objects of its wrath. However, Christians reversed the meaning of the cross by symbolically reimagining it as a speaking figure. The tool of shame was transformed into a voice of truth and an affirmation of God's justice. The speech of the cross served as a declaration that death itself had been vanquished, and that the instrument intended to quell rebellion had instead turned into a spokesperson for resistance. It seemed as if the most hated thing in antiquity had become a prophet, telling believers that the violence of the empire had no last say. It is impossible to separate the political context in which they were written from the symbolism of giant figures and talking objects. Direct challenges were not possible due to Rome's dominance. Declaring open rebellion against Caesar could result in immediate execution. Symbolism provided a shield of defense, a means of conveying realities to insiders while perplexing outsiders. Christians were able to express their disobedience without fear of immediate retaliation by using the language of visions, dreams, and coded imagery. These symbols served as an encoded script of survival for believers who gathered in secret, confirming that their faith was more powerful than the empire's weaponry. Another essential component of Peter's symbolic framework was the idea of resurrection, which was framed in the imagery of cosmic justice. The restoration of order to the universe itself was the goal of the resurrection, not just the return of one man from the dead. Resurrection promised that wrongs would not go unpunished in societies. Where oppression was the norm, emperors imposed their will, and the marginalized had little hope of redress. It was the great equalizer, the guarantee that every life, no matter how it was crushed by authority in this era, would be restored in the next. This interpretation of resurrection struck a chord as a kind of coded political resistance as well as a theological hope. By announcing the resurrection, Peter and others were announcing that justice would triumph on a cosmic level, that Rome's power was fleeting, and that every act of cruelty would be punished by God. The ability to bring people together was inherent in the language of cosmic justice. By reassuring them that their sufferings were not in vain, it brought the community together in solidarity. Imagine a world rearranged in their favor if you saw Jesus as a giant and the cross as a speaking witness. The ultimate fate of those who belonged to Christ was beyond the reach of the empire that claimed to have control over the lives of millions. In this sense, the symbolic writings served as survival literature as well as theological reflection, conveying messages of fortitude to a besieged people. These symbolic depictions also have a deep connection to Jewish apocalyptic thought. Fantastical, exaggerated, and frequently unintelligible imagery was a staple of apocalyptic literature. This language of resistance included cosmic signs, heavenly figures the size of mountains, and beasts with many heads. Apocalyptic symbols served as a means for Jewish communities ruled by the Greeks and then the Romans to describe their struggles in terms of overarching categories. This tradition is well suited to Peter's writings, especially those that emphasize Jesus as a giant and the cross as a speaking entity. They used apocalyptic imagery as a tool to affirm Christ's victory and to subtly encourage people that God's justice was at work, even in the face of persecution. The concept of reversal is central to these symbols. The Christian proclamation transformed death into the gateway to life, while the empire proclaimed death to be the ultimate judgment. Once an embarrassment, the cross has evolved into a badge of honor. A disenfranchised Galilean carpenter who was ridiculed and put to death was declared a cosmic giant who was superior to all earthly kings. One of the most powerful themes that permeates Peter's symbolic vision is reversal. It gave believers hope that God's kingdom would destroy and topple the power structures they observed around them, and that they were only temporary. This reversal provided the oppressed with daily sustenance, a reason to persevere, resist, and hope, not abstract theology. Another example of the early Christian propensity to give theological significance to animated objects is the talking cross. In a society where wooden and stone idols were thought to have spiritual power, Christians reinterpreted the cross as a living testament rather than an idol. Its voice represented the idea that, when touched by divine power, even lifeless, silent torture devices could become messengers of truth. By elevating the cross, a symbol of the empire's cruelty, as God's chosen messenger, this also carried a covert polemic against Roman religious practices, undermining the empire's claim to divine legitimacy. Therefore, comma symbolism was not merely decorative. Rather, it was fundamental to Peter's writings and the societies that preserved them. These believers lacked political clout, wealth, and armies. They possessed symbols, and they molded a different reality through them. The talking cross and the giant Jesus were intentional acts of resistance rather than irrational fantasies. They embodied the belief that justice would triumph, life would triumph over death, and empire would fall. Such images served as both a shield and a sword for those who read these texts in private settings, a shield to keep their meaning safe from outsiders, and a sword to pierce the hope of God's victory through the despair of oppression. Therefore, it is possible to interpret Peter's symbolism as a multi-layered code. At first glance, it offered fanciful visions that appeared innocuous to Roman scrutiny. However, underneath it was a subversive and radical theology of resistance, hope, and justice. Together, they formed a resilient tapestry that enabled the early Christian movement to endure, adjust, and eventually flourish in the face of overwhelming power. Each symbol carried weight, and each image spoke volumes. The giant Jesus and the talking cross are timeless representations of faith's ability to oppose oppression and proclaim a vision of a reordered universe where oppression gives way to justice and death yields to life. rather than being oddities of ancient imagination. Scripture describes Peter's life as the unvarnished, vulnerable journey of a man battling faith, frailty, and the burden of his calling, rather than as the story of a perfect saint. His narrative is replete with episodes of shuddering terror, outbursts of unwavering devotion, and painful setbacks that humble him. Peter is more than just a remote biblical character because of this blend of devotion and contradiction. It gives him a profoundly human quality. His emotional conflicts are reminiscent of the conflicts people encounter in their own lives: loyalty and self-preservation, conviction and doubt, courage and fear. Peter exemplifies what it means to be human while pursuing faith in a world that constantly challenges it through his setbacks and victories. Peter quote, "S unadulterated passion for following Jesus is the first indication of his emotional complexity. When called, he abandons his family, livelihood, and fishing nets because he believes this rabbi holds the truth he has been seeking. However, when fear takes over, it is the same Peter who jumps out of the boat to walk on water that sinks." The conflict between unwavering faith and human frailty is revealed at that precise moment. When the sea is calm, it is simple to trust, but when the storm hits, it reveals the truth. This is something that many people can identify with, beginning with strong commitments to relationships, faith, or personal development, only to falter when faced with hardship. The universal struggle of attempting to overcome fear, but being dragged back by doubt, is reflected in Peter's sinking, which is more than just a historical event. Peter's rejection of Jesus is the most blatant example of his humanity. This moment is the victory of fear over conviction, not merely a failure of loyalty. Just hours before, Peter had vowed to follow Jesus to the end. However, he makes 3 vows that he does not know the person he loves the most while under the stress of recognition in a courtyard, with rumors of danger circulating and the fear of arrest looming large. His words have a timeless impact because they depict the very real way that people can compromise their morals when they are threatened by rejection, pain, or loss. Peter's tears after the rooster crows are not just his own. They are the tears of innumerable people who have denied their greatest loves, betrayed their own principles, or recoiled from the truth when it was necessary to have courage. However, Peter's story does not end with his denial. Contradiction does not deprive a person of purpose, as demonstrated by his return, restoration, and redoubled courage following the resurrection. "Do you love me?" Jesus asks him 3 times. Peter responds with painful candor, saying that it is an invitation to start over rather than a call for perfection. A tale of redemption, woven through weakness, is told by the symmetry of his denial and restoration. Because it reflects the experience of failing, feeling unworthy, and then being given the opportunity to rise again, that very pattern makes Peter relatable to readers in the modern era. Peter's story serves as a reminder that weakness does not negate calling in a society where failure is frequently associated with shame. Peter also demonstrates how fear and courage frequently reside in the same heart. The same man who once rejected Jesus stands in front of thousands of people at Pentecost and boldly proclaims the resurrection, causing Jerusalem's foundations to tremble. His presence has changed from shaking to unwavering, and his words are brimming with fire. But despite this victory, Peter continues to face difficulties. He needs Paul's correction because he falters when dealing with Gentile believers and hesitates. When confronted with cultural barriers, his humanity is highlighted by this rhythm of courage and hesitancy. Faith works within imperfections rather than eliminating them. These days, a lot of people deal with similar contradictions, being brave one moment and feeling insecure the next. They are reassured by Peter's life that inconsistency does not negate devotion, but rather serves as a platform for development. His contradictions are what give his testimony strength, not flaws to be concealed. For contemporary readers, Peter's hardships are not merely historical oddities. Rather, they serve as reflections of their own difficulties. People are aware of what it's like to speak confidently one minute and falter the next. They understand the anguish of disappointing loved ones, of recoiling when honesty becomes too costly, and of regretting hurriedly spoken words. Peter is a perfect example of the conflict that arises when one wants to be unwavering but is influenced by others. Because he exposes the truth of a faith that is not immune to human weakness through his own contradictions, this tension makes him someone to understand rather than to idolize. Peter, quote, "S emotional depth is influenced by intense loyalty and love in addition to fear and denial. Peter is the one who pulls out a sword and recklessly strikes out in defense when the soldiers arrive to arrest Jesus. This act, despite its misdirection, shows a fierce devotion that cannot stand the idea of his master being taken. His impetuous bravery, which stems from love rather than cunning, serves as yet another reminder of his humanity. Love frequently motivates people to take risky but flawed actions. Through his imperfections, Peter's loyalty demonstrates how messy, erratic, and contradictory love can be. Peter, quote, "S life's hardships are reminiscent of those of contemporary people. People live with rejection fears, deny the truths they know, and yearn for bravery but frequently give in to peer pressure. They struggle with internal contradictions, wanting to be strong but stumbling over their flaws. Like Peter, though, they also experience flashes of bravery, loyalty, and personal development. His narrative reassures them that faith is about learning to get back up after falling, not about eliminating the contradictions. It is about choosing to move on, despite the weight of past failures, and about clinging to love when fear threatens to silence it. The deeper reality that faith is lived in perseverance rather than perfection is also conveyed by Peter's humanity. His experience demonstrates that growth frequently results from repeated recovery rather than unbroken success. A story arc of stumbling and rising is formed by the denial in the courtyard, the tears that followed, and the bravery at Pentecost. People in today's world struggle with shame, fall short of their own expectations, and then find the strength to keep going. Through Peter, faith becomes more about having the guts to keep going in spite of imperfections rather than about striving for perfection. Peter, quote, story is powerful because it shows a man whose contradictions make his faith authentic, rather than a saint devoid of contradictions. People can identify with his story, weak, scared, loyal, and brave all at once. It reassures them that their hardships do not deprive them of meaning, but rather align them with a key figure in the early church. Peter makes it abundantly evident that despite all of humanity's contradictions, faith can flourish because of us. A renewed interest in early Christian texts that had been long forgotten, disregarded, or even purposefully suppressed emerged in the 19th century as the contemporary academic study of religion started to take shape. Writings attributed to Peter, such as letters, apocryphal acts, and particularly the Gospel of Peter, garnered particular attention among these texts. For centuries, church tradition had relegated Peter to the role of the fisherman who became an apostle, both heroic and flawed, as he is remembered in the canonical Gospels and Acts. However, during the rediscovery era, academics began to realize that Peter's voice might not have been limited to the New Testament. Fragments, translations, and texts buried in the sands of Egypt or Turkey started to provide hints of a larger narrative. Through the prism of Peter's lost writings, scholars have been re-examining issues of history, theology, and identity since this period of rediscovery, which has continued well into the 21st century. The most well-known rediscovery occurred in Akhmim, Egypt, in the late 19th century when pieces of the Gospel of Peter were discovered in a monk's tomb. The discovery astounded academics. At the time, due to its radical theological overtones, as well as the text's striking and unique depictions of the Passion. The Gospel of Peter, in contrast to the canonical accounts, tended toward what many referred to as a docetic interpretation, in which Jesus' suffering seemed less genuine and more like a divine play being performed in the world. Serapion of Antioch and other early church fathers believed that this was the exact reason the text had been rejected centuries earlier. However, this rediscovery gave contemporary scholars an opportunity to examine Christianity from a new angle and to consider what other voices might have existed in the early communities and why they were suppressed. Archaeology was soon not the only topic of discussion. Historians started to wonder if Docetism, which had long been written off as heresy, was actually a popular school of thought in early Christianity. Many believers may have had a very different understanding of Jesus' divinity than the orthodoxy, later imposed by councils and creeds according to the Gospel of Peter, if it accurately represented a docetic worldview. Some contended that this demonstrated how diverse Christianity was before it solidified into a single predominantly Christian tradition. Others retorted that the ideas presented in books such as Peter's Gospel are outlier experiments that were never accepted by the majority. Even though there is still disagreement over the text, the fact that it is studied at all highlights the contemporary trend in historical research toward appreciating diversity rather than homogeneity. Findings like the Nag Hammadi Library, which altered the intellectual atmosphere even though it did not directly contain a Gospel of Peter, sped up the rediscovery of apocryphal texts in the 20th century. Scholars were suddenly unable to overlook the diversity of Christian expression in antiquity. In this context, Peter's writings, whether authentic or attributed, were re-examined as a component of a broader whole. With its dramatic account of Peter's crucifixion inverted, the Acts of Peter became a vehicle for examining themes of authority and martyrdom. One of the first representations of heaven and hell was found in the Apocalypse of Peter, which has been preserved in both Greek and Ethiopian traditions. This helped shape later Christian ideas about the afterlife. Scholars were compelled by these rediscovered or re-examined works to re-evaluate Peter not only as a disciple, but also as a literary figure and a symbol that various communities centered their identities around. The issue of authorship has also been the subject of theological discussion. Were these texts written in his name to give legitimacy to certain beliefs, or did Peter actually write or inspire them? Pseudonymous authorship was thought to compromise authenticity for centuries. However, contemporary academics have become more sophisticated. They imply that writing in the name of a revered person like Peter was not always regarded as forgery in antiquity, but rather as a means of taking part in an ongoing tradition. This raises additional queries, such as whether the Gospel of Peter was a community's tribute to its understanding of Christ. Was Peter's apocalypse a pastoral attempt to warn or offer hope? Modern scholarship has given these texts new dignity by redefining authorship in terms of collective voice rather than individual authorship. Psychological and sociological interpretations of these works also emerged in the 20th century. In addition to their theological significance, scholars started analyzing Peter's writings for their insights into oppressed communities. For instance, the seeming docetism in the Gospel of Peter may be interpreted as a reaction to persecution. Perhaps believers could face their own hardships with the belief that true reality was somewhere else, out of their tormentor's grasp, if Jesus' suffering was merely an appearance. The agony of oppressed groups yearning for justice may be reflected in Peter's Apocalypse, with its vivid punishments for the wicked and rewards for the righteous. These interpretations do not treat the texts as abstract theological experiments, but rather situate them within the lived struggles of early Christians. Scholarly discussions about Peter's lost voice have expanded in the 21st century. Some scholars concentrate on these works' literary artistry, pointing out how they use irony, symbolism, and dramatic structure to convey their ideas. Others examine the history of reception, tracking the ways in which shards of Peter's voice shaped later customs through art, liturgy, or sermons. An important case study in canon formation is the Apocalypse of Peter, which was originally thought to be part of the New Testament but was ultimately left out. This shows how political choices, theological conflicts, and historical circumstances influenced what believers would eventually consider to be sacred scripture. The rediscovery has also been aided by digital technology. Scholars around the world can now access digitized manuscripts that were previously hidden away in archives. This has opened up the discussion and democratized the study of apocryphal texts. New viewpoints are offered by graduate students, independent researchers, and interdisciplinary scholars, who frequently make links between Peter's writings and more general subjects like memory, trauma, and identity. The availability of these texts has also spurred a resurgence of interest in popular culture, with authors, filmmakers, and artists using the lost tales of Peter as a basis for their own examinations of faith and skepticism. The realization that Peter's contradictions reflect those of humanity as a whole, even in the academic world, is arguably the most significant development. His writings are both orthodox and heterodox, traditional and experimental, just as Peter was both fearless and fearful, devoted and defiant. They are difficult to classify and defy attempts to categorize them as either central or marginal. In this sense, contemporary interpretations have preserved Peter's voice by accepting its contradictions rather than minimizing them. Peter stands at the intersection of these tensions as a figure who personifies faith under pressure, weakness turned into strength, and authority tempered by failure. Scholars are increasingly arguing that the richness of early Christianity lies precisely in its tensions. One thing has emerged from ongoing scholarly discussions. The rediscovery of Peter's writings is about more than just completing historical knowledge gaps. It is about confronting the same issues that continue to plague both religious and secular thought. What does suffering entail? In what ways does divine presence manifest itself in human frailty? Is faith able to withstand contradiction? Modern scholarship has accomplished more than just recovering ancient texts by bringing Peter's lost voice to the fore. It has reignited age-old arguments concerning the nature of truth, community, and belief. And throughout this process, Peter, the imperfect but enduring apostle, keeps speaking, not just as a representative of the past, but also as a window into the current challenges. The Gospel of Peter was obscured for centuries, disregarded as heresy, forgotten by the majority, and only mentioned in passing in old writings. Its tale of mystery, repression, and rediscovery demonstrates how history can become brittle when influential people choose which voices are buried and which are kept alive. This gospel was both a rival and a companion to the stories that would eventually form the New Testament from the beginning. Some early communities held it in high regard, while others were afraid of it. Eventually, the Church Fathers' authority put an end to it. However, the text endured despite the weight of suppression. Its shards have surfaced over centuries, serving as a reminder to the world that not all historical voices were entirely lost. The Gospel of Peter's challenge to orthodoxy is the source of its tension. Church leaders who desired unity and control over doctrine were troubled by the details and viewpoints this text offers, which contrast with the way the canonical Gospels portray Christ. Echoing theological currents such as Docetism, which denied or downplayed Christ's physical suffering. The gospel focused on a vision of Jesus that tended toward a more spiritualized form of resurrection. This posed a risk to those forming the early church. Their authority to preach about sacrifice, redemption, and salvation through the body of the crucified one was compromised by a Christ who did not bleed and die in the flesh. The church fathers thought they had established theological order by declaring the text heretical, but in actuality they had silenced a voice that authentically reflected the diversity of early Christianity. Old wounds and questions were reopened when it was discovered in the Egyptian sands centuries later. The uncomfortable reality that the early Christian world was far more diverse than tradition acknowledged was brought home to both scholars and believers when shards of the gospel began to surface in the late 19th century. A text that was believed to have been lost forever suddenly came back to life, offering different perspectives on the crucifixion and resurrection. There was a sense of familiarity and strangeness in the narrative style, the imagery, and the theological undertones. Though it used the same language as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this gospel was not alien. Rather, it carried a distinct emphasis that dared to put mystery above clarity, vision above history, and spirit above flesh. This rediscovery brought up an important question for readers in the modern era. What does it mean to silence a gospel? Erasing a text means trying to silence a people, a viewpoint, or a way of seeing the divine in addition to deleting words from history. The struggle of memory against power is what the Gospel of Peter symbolizes, not just theological conflict. Despite the church's efforts to bury it, its existence shows that truth cannot be entirely suppressed. Every time the text reappears, it challenges the tidy boundaries established by tradition, making us acknowledge that Christianity was never a single entity, but rather a synthesis of voices, tales, and visions. Its rediscovery sparked heated discussions. Scholars debated theology, authenticity, and origin. Was this really Peter's voice? Was his authority borrowed in a later composition? Was it a heretical distortion or a faithful witness to the resurrection? The arguments that raged in the 2nd century were echoed in these questions. Paradoxically, the Gospel's rediscovery brought back the old debates about it in addition to the text itself. History was being repeated in this way. Once again, the same voice that they had attempted to silence centuries before was disturbing. The faithful and igniting arguments that would not go away. The significance of this rediscovery extends beyond academic circles to anyone looking for a more comprehensive understanding of spiritual history. It serves as a reminder that early Christianity is not fully documented in the Bible as we currently understand it. Councils, power struggles, and the choices made by men who decided what should be kept and what should be destroyed shaped it. Today, reading the Gospel of Peter is like opening a window into the paths not taken, the viewpoints lost, and the questions that remain unsolved. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth never ends, and that no canon can ever fully capture all of the ways in which people have encountered God. Therefore, the Gospel of Peter serves as both an invitation and a challenge. An invitation to look for wisdom outside of the confines we've inherited, as well as a challenge to traditions that maintain their version is the only one. It serves as a reminder that the early followers of Jesus were dynamic, varied, and fervently interested in deciphering the mystery of Christ rather than being homogeneous in their beliefs. By rediscovering this text, we rediscover the vitality of that 1st century conflict, which was about identity, authority, and the very meaning of faith. In addition to theology, one thing stands out above all else as we come to the end of this exploration of the mystery, struggle, and rediscovery of the Gospel of Peter. History cannot permanently silence the past. Whether through papyrus fragments, lost libraries, or the curiosity of seekers who don't believe the official version of events is the only one worth hearing, voices buried by power have a way of resurfacing. More than just an old book, the Gospel of Peter is a testament to humankind's tenacity, survival, and insatiable thirst for knowledge. This forgotten gospel's strength lies in both what it asks of us now and what it reveals about the past. It forces us to pay close attention, ask daring questions, and understand that silence does not imply absence. The Church attempted to silence this voice for centuries, but here it is, centuries later, still alive, still speaking, still challenging. In many respects, the story of Peter's Gospel is the story of all silenced voices. They may be silenced for a while, but they are eventually heard once more. Thus, we conclude with a truth that has reverberated throughout history and time. From the early church fathers who were afraid of it to the scholars who brought it back to life to us, who read it now. The voice they attempted to silence is speaking once more. If this journey into the forgotten gospel has touched you, please remember to subscribe, share this video with others who are looking for hidden truths, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and look for links in the description that will help you learn more about the mystery of Peter's voice. What if a gospel existed that revealed the truths Peter himself taught, but it was hidden from the world? Imagine for a moment that the very voice of one of Jesus' closest disciples, the one who walked on water, who denied and then was restored, who preached with fire and authority, had been silenced, not by chance, but by choice. How different would the story of Christianity look if Peter's own testimony had not been left in the shadows? Throughout history, voices have been lost. Some were silenced because they were too dangerous, too challenging to the established order. Others were forgotten in caves, burned in libraries, or deliberately erased from memory. And then there are the voices that whisper from fragments, the writings that survived against the odds, carrying with them the weight of something forbidden. We live in a time obsessed with uncovering what has been hidden. Long-lost artifacts, ancient scrolls, forgotten knowledge buried beneath layers of dust and denial. But none of these discoveries carries the same power as when it touches faith itself, when it dares to ask whether the Bible we hold today is truly complete. This is where the Gospel of Peter emerges, not as a faint rumor, but as a provocative text that confronts the question, what were the early Christians hiding, and why was Peter's voice locked away for centuries? The story of the Gospel of Peter is as dramatic as the passion narrative it tells. It begins not with harmony, but with controversy. Early church leaders debated it fiercely, some revering it, others condemning it. And when the smoke of history cleared, it disappeared from sight, only to be rediscovered much later like a message in a bottle drifting back to shore. But unlike the familiar Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this text bore a different tone, one that unsettled, one that dared to depict the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus with imagery unlike anything preserved in the canon. Why would the church fathers suppress it? Why would Peter's supposed gospel be branded dangerous? Was it because it revealed too much, or perhaps revealed something that challenged the narrative the rising church wanted to maintain? Think of the world we live in today. Voices are censored, stories are manipulated, and truth is often drowned beneath the noise of power. That is not new. It has always been the way of things. And yet, history has a way of unearthing what was meant to be forgotten. The Gospel of Peter stands as a symbol of that unearthed truth, of forbidden knowledge pressing its way through silence. To read it is to enter a narrative that feels familiar and unfamiliar all at once. The crucifixion is described with haunting detail, but the resurrection scene, the resurrection, is unlike anything in the New Testament. Soldiers see a stone roll back by itself, a cross that speaks, a Christ who emerges taller than the heavens. It is imagery both mystical and majestic, almost cinematic, as though the veil of ordinary storytelling was torn away to show something that cannot be contained in human words. And this is where the mystery deepens. Was Peter truly its author? Or was his name attached to lend authority to a text written by another hand? Scholars debate endlessly, but for believers, the question is larger. Why was this text hidden, and what does it mean for our understanding of Jesus? Lost voices always carry weight, because they remind us of the fragility of memory. Think of the libraries burned in Alexandria, the scrolls scattered in the desert, the suppressed songs of enslaved peoples, the forgotten languages of tribes, erased by conquest. The Gospel of Peter belongs to that same family of silenced truths. Whether or not it is authentic in the scholarly sense, it is authentic in the sense that it was read, loved, feared, and ultimately buried. And now, we hold it again. Imagine Peter himself standing in front of you,